Hello everybody, let's learn how to make a skybox with React 3 Fiber and build this scene together. So what we're looking at right now is a very simple React 3 Fiber scene with a skybox and a reflective sphere in the center. So the stuff we're going to cover today is just making the skybox itself and then setting up those reflections that we're seeing in the sphere, as that's sort of an extra step that you have to do to get it to work. Great, so let's get started. We're going to start with a brand new code sandbox so that everyone can follow along with building this finish scene here. It's only about 100 lines, so it's not going to take too long. Let's just go and create a new sandbox, and we'll use the default React template for code sandbox. And we'll give it a second here to load up. We'll see something like this, hello code sandbox, and we're ready to get started. The first thing we need to do is install the dependencies for React 3 Fiber. So those are obviously React 3 Fiber and 3 itself. And that's all we really need to get started. So now that we have our dependencies installed, we can start by just creating an empty React 3 Fiber scene to use. So if we refer back to the completed project, there's a couple things we can grab from it. So the first thing I'm going to do is get the CSS properties here and move those over to the CSS for the new project. And the reason I'm doing this is just because it's going to set all of these parent elements to be width 100% and height 100% and turn off the margin and padding so that our React 3 Fiber scene will take up the entire viewport. So now that we've done that, we can go back to the app.js file and start by, let's just import the canvas component from React 3 Fiber. And then we can replace all of this placeholder stuff with that canvas and get rid of those children because they are HTML elements and not 3D objects. So once we've done that, we should have a blank scene here. And if you were to go and inspect this project in the Chrome DevTools, we should see a HTML canvas element. If you're seeing that, that means that everything's working so far. So now that we have our empty canvas, we can start by adding, let's just add the sphere to the scene first, just a basic simple sphere. So let's make a new component, call it sphere, and that will return a some 3D geometry for us to use. So we'll need a mesh. And inside of the mesh, we'll need the geometry and a material. I'm just going to go and copy and paste it from the finished project because this is just boilerplate pretty much. So this is our sphere right here. And we have sphere geometry and a mesh basic material. There's also a light in here, which shouldn't be in there. So I'm going to remove that. We can take this Get rid of this prop for now. We'll see how that works later. And then put our sphere inside of the canvas. And there we go. We just have a flat sphere with no lighting and nothing going on really, which is okay, because we're going to just keep moving right along and start doing the fun stuff and adding the skybox. So to add the skybox, let's make another component to start out called the skybox. And this one is going to work a little differently. So a skybox is going to have some geometry. It's actually going to be a big cube that surrounds the entire scene. And then using some special techniques, we can apply textures to the inside of all the sides of the cube so that it kind of looks like there's a background in every direction of the scene. So going back to the finished project, we can break down the parts of the skybox component and start rebuilding it. So you'll see a couple of things here. So first of all, even though I said there's geometry, we actually aren't going to create any geometry with this. We're just going to use a property of the Three.js scene to set the background. And Three.js is actually going to know that we're loading a cube texture, and it's going to apply it to kind of like a cube that it's going to create for us. So we're not going to have to worry about that. But what we are going to have to worry about is using a couple of hooks from React 3 Fiber to get at the scene object that is a part of Three.js. So the first line in our skybox component is going to be this one here, where we call this use3 hook and return back a scene object that we can use to set the background. So let's go ahead and start writing that. The first thing we need to do is import it from React 3 Fiber. So on line 2, we just want to grab the use3 hook, and then we can destructure the return value of the hook and get the scene. All right, so now we have access to the scene, and with that, we're going to need to assign a texture to the background. So we have to use a texture loader, and there's a bunch of different ways we can do this. In our case, we're going to use a CubeTextureLoader from the Three.js package. There is a use loader hook in React 3 Fiber, but it's a little bit easier to do it like this since we're doing this CubeTextureLoader. So we are going to add another import from 3 to get that CubeTextureLoader. So let's go ahead and do that now. We'll do import CubeTextureLoader from 3, and then back in our skybox component, we can initialize the loader like this. So we're creating a new CubeTextureLoader and assigning it to the value loader. And then now that we have the loader, we can call it. It's a function, and send in all of the textures that we want to load. And since this is a CubeTextureLoader, the loader is going to accept an array as its first and only required argument of paths to images that we want to load for all 6 sides of the cube. And so I just named 6 JPEGs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, the next thing that we're going to need to do is actually get access to those textures. So in CubeSandbox, anything that we put in the public directory here will be hosted at the relative root path of your project. So we can actually go ahead and import those by clicking on the little up arrow next to the public directory and selecting all 6 of them, and go ahead and just upload those. If you want to use the same 6 images that I have, you can download them from the CubeSandbox. There will be a link to it in the video description. If you want to make your own Skybox, go for it. It's super fun. You can use any image editing tool you're comfortable with to build it. The only thing you need to be aware of is you need to make sure that the edges of the 6 textures blend together well. If you've ever tried to make a repeating pattern before for a texture, you'll know kind of how to do this. This scene, these 6 textures are not a perfect blend, so I'll point out what issues you will run into if they don't blend together. They're just 6 kind of cool textures that I had from an old project that I worked on with a friend a couple of years ago. So, I just wanted to reuse them for the tutorial. And I think I lost one of the textures at some point. They probably used to blend together perfectly originally. I just lost one of the edges, so I'm repeating one of them. So cool. Now we are calling loader.load, and loader is a cube texture loader. We're calling it with one argument, and that is an array of images. And we have this texture value that we're not doing anything yet with. So what's the next step? Very simple. Let's just set the scene background to texture. Scene.background is the texture. The texture is this guy. And then we can return null here because since we're not creating any geometry in the skybox, we don't actually need to return anything. And if you save that, you'll still won't have anything happening because we're not using the skybox yet in the canvas. So let's just go and pop that in. And we'll probably need to refresh. Wow, okay. So it is loading. You can't see anything yet because we don't have any camera controls, so you can't rotate this around. And you'll notice that the sphere is just a flat white. It has no reflections of any type yet. We may want to add a light actually just to, it's not going to matter in the final scene when the reflections are on, but we could have maybe a default directional light with an intensity of, say, 0.5. And we just add that into the canvas. Yeah, I mean, let's not even do that. It's kind of a distraction from what we're trying to accomplish. So let's ignore that and focus on getting this sphere to have reflections. It's just solid white right now. It's got a color of white. So what do we need to do to get reflections? Well, it's not as simple as just setting a prop and saying like, turn on reflections. You need to do a little trick where you add a camera to the scene, which will act as kind of like the sphere's point of view. And not only one camera, but sort of 6 cameras pointing in all directions. And then we need to take the output of those cameras and write them to a texture that the sphere can use. I know that seems a little weird, but that is how you do it in Three.js and how you do it in React 3 Fiber 2. So we'll be introducing a couple new concepts to make that happen. Luckily, nothing too crazy. And to start with, we'll want to do use 3 again, this time in our sphere instead of in the Skybox component, and grab some references to the scene and to the GL context just because we need it to set up that camera I mentioned with the sphere's point of view. So we can go back to our work in progress, and we already have the use 3 hook. So we can, just like we did in the Skybox, except adding the GL return value, get those 2 references from the use 3 hook, which will be useful a lot of times when you're working on React 3 Fiber projects, just to get the context of the scene and kind of dig in and set settings and all kinds of stuff. Once we have that, we are ready to create a new render target, is what it's called. And the render target it's like a buffer to store some pixel data, and we're going to use it to store a texture. And looking at this guy here, so cube render target equals new WebGL cube render target. So there's different types of render targets, but we want a cube one because we're going to use it as a cube texture. And we want to pass it 2 parameters. The first one is actually the size of the texture. It's the size of the buffer that we're going to be storing. So 256 is good enough because of the size of the sphere that you can't really see any pixelation. But if I were to turn this all the way down to like 16, look what happens. It gets all gross and there's hardly any detail. That's because I'm only providing 16 by 16 resolution to the texture. So 256 is good. If you had something where you were going to use this render target for something that was going to be bigger and you might need to zoom in on it or get more detail, you might have to optimize this. You could go up to higher resolutions. 512 actually even looks a little bit better in Sphere. We can leave it at that for now. You just got to optimize that for memory and make sure it doesn't slow down your scene if you have too many reflections going on that are using that render target. So let's just copy and paste this and move it into our project. And by doing that, we're going to notice a couple of missing imports. We need to grab those from the 3 package. None of these are part of React 3 Fiber that we're using right now. We're just grabbing them directly from the Three.js project. You'll notice that this object is a second parameter to the WebGL cube render target constructor, and it's an options object. So it's not super important to understand what all these objects mean right now, or all these options mean right now, just to build a Skybox. So let's ignore it for the moment. You can just use these default settings. And there we go. So now we have a instance of a cube render target, and we can use that to construct a new CubeCamera. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier, where we need 6 cameras. Well, luckily, Three.js has a class that will do that for us, and that's called a CubeCamera. That will let us set up a camera that's pointing in all 6 directions, and then we give it a render target as the 3rd argument, and that is going to pipe the camera data into that render target so that we have it stored somewhere. So let's grab that and add it right after the cube render target. It's yelling at us about adding it as an import, so we need to import it from 3. Still nothing changing in our scene because we haven't actually hooked up any of this yet. Now let's go ahead and set the CubeCamera to be in the 0, 0, 0, these are XYZ values, position so that it's in the same place as the sphere. And then call scene.add, passing in the CubeCamera to add it to the scene. Great, so now we have the camera in the scene, still not doing anything. So what's next? We'll get back to what this use frame call does in a minute. First, let's set an env map prop on the material in the sphere. So this is our sphere mesh that we created at the very beginning, has the geometry, has the material, still has the color white, has some properties on the material, roughness and metalness values. But we're going to add one called env map. And the value of the env map, which stands for environment map, is going to be it's actually going to be a property that is on the CubeCamera itself, not the cube render target. Even though we're passing that into the CubeCamera, that's just telling the CubeCamera what it can use. In order to get the actual texture, we can just use a reference off of the CubeCamera to its render target and then get the texture. So now if we go back here, we can add that prop, env map, CubeCamera, render target texture. Something just changed, so it's just black right now. Sometimes the auto refresh doesn't catch up on everything, so you need to reset the scene. All right, so now it's all black. Still not actually getting anything. Well, why is that? So we need to do one more thing. We need to call the update method on the CubeCamera. And what that's going to do is it's going to cause the camera to actually update the texture in the cube render target so that we can use it. So we can go ahead and do that. And we'll want to get the use frame hook added to the imports from React 3 Fiber. Going back down here, we'll want to do this under the part where we added the camera. It doesn't actually matter, but the use frame hook takes in a function, so we can pass it a arrow function here. And all we want to do is call CubeCamera update. And we need to give it the GL context and the scene. Save that and refresh, and there's our reflection. Nothing's moving, so it's kind of overkill to update this every time, but we've now hooked up the reflections to the sphere, which is great. We're 99% of the way there. The only thing that we really need to do now to finish this up is let's add a orbital camera to this scene so we can move it around and see some stuff. I am going to show you the way of adding an orbit camera that I had gotten used to. This is a perfectly good way to do it, but recently I've been using the Dre package, which is another package created by the React 3 Fiber maintainers that has a bunch of really cool helpers for React 3 Fiber, and they have an orbit controls component that makes this a breeze to pop in. Since this isn't really the point of the video, we'll just do it the old-fashioned way and import orbit controls from the 3 package, actually from the examples directory, And then we need to get the extend function from React 3 Fiber, and just at the top of the scene, call extend with an object containing orbit controls. And that will register the orbit controls class so that React 3 Fiber knows about it. And then we can use it just like we use other React or other Three.js objects. And I'm just going to copy this entire camera controls component that I made for the sake of time. And then we'll need to get the use ref hook from React as well. If you're interested in how this works, I do have a blog article about this process of setting up orbit controls that I can link, or search for Drei, that's DREI for React 3 Fiber, and just use their camera controls, orbit controls component. It's basically just like as if you could import this whole thing and have the extend and everything done for you, and you don't have to do anything except use this component, which is what we're going to do next. We're going to add camera controls to our scene, and you'll notice that it starts rotating automatically by itself. That's because I have the auto rotate set to true. If you know anything about React, you know you don't actually need to do that. You can just, in fact, it's usually better to do it like this for linting. And there you go. So you can also click and hold and drag around and see our entire skybox. And yeah, it's pretty cool. There's a background in all the directions. This is what I was talking about where I said your 6 textures need to blend together. If you look at the corner right here, you see how there's kind of an obvious boundary. That's just because my textures are, I'm missing one, and there was one that was supposed to go here that would blend in perfectly. So give it a try. Try making your own skybox. It could be anything. You could, make one with clouds or different space scene, whatever you want. So I hope that has been helpful. I think creating skyboxes is a pretty common task, and this is a good way to do it. So thanks for watching. Bye.